There was a season when the world did not darken all at once. The fading began slowly, so slowly that even the mountains did not notice at first. The warmth that once settled gently across the land began to thin, not vanish. Mornings arrived pale, as if the sky had forgotten how to hold its color. Even the birds, rising from their branches, hesitated before committing their voices to the air. It was not yet night, but it was no longer full day. Above the valleys and distant waters, light softened. It did not retreat in fear. It did not extinguish itself. It simply withdrew like a tide slipping back from shore, leaving behind a damp memory where warmth had been. The world, which had always relied upon that steady brilliance, felt the change in its smallest details first. Lanterns were lit earlier, not out of alarm, but out of habit adjusting itself. Hands reached for flame without urgency. Wicks caught fire and held it quietly, their glow trembling in the faint coolness that had begun to linger. Shrines stood beneath lengthening shadows. The wooden beams of the shrine cooled faster than usual, their surfaces no longer warmed by long hours of the sun. Moss clung to stone with a deeper green. Offerings rested untouched, as if waiting for a presence that had grown distant without leaving entirely. Somewhere beyond sight, beyond mountain ridges and drifting cloud, the sun goddess had turned inward. No announcement was made. No tremor shook the ground. The absence unfolded like a thought too heavy to carry. Rivers adjusted next. Their surfaces reflected dimmer skies. Silver where once they had been gold. Fish moved more slowly beneath the current. The rhythm of flowing water deepened in tone, as though it now carried the weight of something unspoken. Along the banks, reeds bent in wind that felt cooler than it should have been for that time of year. Still, nothing was broken. The world did not panic. It watched. In villages tucked between cedar forests and low hills, doors opened to unfamiliar mornings. Pale light filtered through paper screens, softer and more uncertain. The air felt thinner against the skin, not cold, but absent of the gentle pressure of warmth that had once rested everywhere. And yet, life continued. Rice was prepared, water drawn, steps taken along familiar paths. Children noticed only that their shadows were longer. Elders noticed that dusk arrived earlier. No one spoke of disappearance. There was only a shared awareness, subtle, instinctive, that something vast had shifted its gaze. High above, clouds gathered more frequently. They did not storm. They drifted in quiet layers, diffusing what little brilliance remained. At times the sky felt suspended in a permanent late afternoon, caught between brightness and surrender. The horizon lost its sharpness, melting gently into a color that could not decide whether it belonged to day or evening. Within the forests, bark darkened, leaves caught less shimmer. Even insects altered their cadence, their hum softer, more patient. The world's smallest creatures adapted first, as they always do. Time slowed, not dramatically, not enough to be measured, but perceptibly. Moments seemed to stretch, like threads pulled gently but not broken. The space between breaths widened. The echo of footsteps lingered longer against wooden floors. Somewhere within stone and sky, like rested, it did not rage against confinement. It did not resist its own withdrawal. It folded inward, contained like warmth stored beneath ash. There was no violence in its absence, only stillness. This was not destruction. It was concealment. Deep within the memory of the earth, a cavern waited, a cave shaped by ancient patience. Its entrance did not close. It simply grew heavy with shadow. Within it, the faintest glimmer remained, contained but not extinguished. The world did not seek to force its return. Instead, it adjusted. Lantern flames steadied themselves against longer nights. Villages moved closer together after dusk. Stories, once told beneath bright afternoons, shifted to the quiet comfort of shared dimness. Hands lingered near warmth longer than before. Darkness did not conquer. It settled, and in that settling balance began to form. The mountains accepted cooler stone. Rivers accepted muted reflections. Fields waited beneath skies that seemed perpetually hesitant. Even the wind altered its tone, moving not with urgency, but with contemplation. Somewhere beyond visible light, the sun goddess remained, not vanished, not lost, only hidden. The world did not cry out for explanation. It leaned into patience, for in the deepest rhythms of existence, there's an understanding older than language, that light, when it withdraws, does so not to abandon, but to rest, that absence is sometimes a form of preservation, that warmth, remembered, is still warmth. So the earth waited. Lanterns burned a little longer. Rivers carried dim reflections faithfully. Mountains held their silhouettes against a quieter sky, and in that extended dusk, where neither day nor night claimed dominion, the story of concealment began. Not with thunder, not with grief, but with a world learning how to breathe without brightness. The return had not yet begun, but neither had hope diminished, for even in shadow the memory of light remained gentle, patient, and unbroken. The dimness did not deepen all at once. It thickened gradually, like ink spreading slowly through water. What had first seemed like a long dusk became something steadier, a softened world suspended beneath an uncertain sky. Above the mountains, clouds no longer drifted apart. They lingered in pale layers, muting the horizon. The outlines of distant peaks blurred gently, their sharpness replaced by something quieter and more forgiving. Even the air seemed to hold less brilliance, as though light had folded itself inward and left only a faint memory in its wake. Within the forests, bark absorbed shadow more completely. Moss brightened strangely in the absence of harsh warmth, its green deepening into something velvety and rich. Leaves no longer shimmered. They rested. Their surfaces reflected only diffused light, like water beneath overcast skies. At the edge of a clearing, a shrine stood beneath tall cedar trees, a shrine long accustomed to the steady rhythm of the sun. Its wooden beams had once carried warmth well into evening. Now they cooled before noon. The ropes that hung at its entrance stirred gently in air that felt neither warm nor cold, but suspended. Offerings remained untouched longer than before, not out of neglect, but because time itself seemed to stretch between gestures. Those who visited found themselves moving more slowly, their hands lingering above stone before withdrawing. The world did not feel empty. It felt paused, far beyond the reach of villages and rivers, where stone curved inward into ancient silence. A cave cradled a hidden presence. It was not a cavern carved by violence. It had formed patiently over ages, hollowed by earth's own shifting weight, shaped by water that once moved through it in distant centuries. Now it held stillness. Within its depth, there was no darkness as humans imagine it. There was density, a softness layered upon itself, and at its center light remained, not blazing, not extinguished, but resting, folded inward like a cloak drawn gently across its own radiance. The sun goddess did not rage within that stillness. There was no conflict in concealment, only withdrawal. Outside, the world adapted further. Rivers grew quieter in tone. Their surfaces no longer scattered brilliance in sharp reflections. Instead, they carried a muted silver, broken only when wind passed across them. Fish swam deeper beneath the surface, where light had never ruled strongly. Along the banks, reeds bent lower. Their tips brushed the water, tracing lines that lingered longer than before. The sound of their movement shifted from bright rustling to something softer, like fabric moving across stone. In villages nestled between hills, lanterns became companions rather than necessities. They were lit before true night arrived and allowed to burn long afterward. Their flames steadied themselves in the dimness, their glow warming wood and paper screens in ways the sky no longer could. Shadows grew gentler. They no longer struck sharply across walls. They pulled and softened, merging with corners instead of dividing space. Children watched them stretch across floors and found that they moved more slowly than memory suggested. Even birds altered their rhythm. Their morning calls began later, as if uncertain when dawn truly arrived. At times they would startle themselves into song, only to quiet again when brightness failed to follow. The world did not collapse. It recalibrated. On a distant hillside, frost formed where it had not before, not thickly, only enough to outline grass with pale edges. It melted quickly, but its presence lingered in the air as a suggestion of change. The scale of perception shifted, from mountains to frost, from sky to the delicate rim of a single blade of grass. The earth, sensing imbalance, did not resist it. It leaned into stillness. Within the cave, silence deepened. The cavern walls held memory in their stone, echoes of past brightness, traces of warmth absorbed over centuries. Now they reflected none of it outward. Instead, they cradled the faint pulse at their center. Light did not flicker. It did not attempt to escape. It remained steady, but contained like breath held in contemplation. There was no bitterness in this retreat. The absence of radiance was not punishment. It was retreat for reasons older than understanding. Outside, time widened further. Farmers paused longer in fields, sensing that growth moved at a different pace. Seeds pressed into soil did not fail, but they rose more gradually, their green breaking through earth with patience rather than urgency. The sky rarely cleared fully now. It hovered between pale gray and diluted gold. At times, a thin brightness would push briefly through the clouds, touching treetops and shrine roofs for only a moment before fading again. Those moments felt fragile, not dramatic, just fleeting. And when they passed, the world did not protest. It accepted. Even wind altered its behavior. Where it once moved briskly through valleys, it now traveled in long, steady currents. It brushed across fields with measured restraint, carrying coolness rather than warmth. Lantern flames responded accordingly. Their glow deepened in color, amber instead of gold. Their reflections trembled in windows, more prominent against dim surroundings. Night and day began to resemble one another. The difference lay not in brightness, but in texture. Day carried a thin gray diffusion. Night held deeper blue tones. Between them, the world hovered in extended twilight. The mountains, ancient and patient, observed without commentary. They had known eras when fire covered the sky and ages when ice claimed the valleys. This soft concealment did not alarm them. It simply marked another turning within cycles too vast for urgency. And yet, even they sensed the quiet gravity of it. Within the cave, something shifted. Not outward, but inward. Light drew closer to its own center. Its radiance condensed, becoming denser without becoming brighter. It felt less like illumination and more like presence. The sun goddess rested in that density, not asleep, not awake, suspended. The world above, though dimmed, did not grow cold beyond endurance. It found equilibrium in reduced brilliance. Creatures adjusted their sight. Plants widened their leaves to gather what little filtered through. Rivers continued their descent toward distant seas. Shrines continued to stand. Lanterns continued to burn. The change was not catastrophe. It was endurance. Scale shifted again. From the cavern's hidden center to the edge of a single lantern flame to the breath of a villager watching the sky. Breath slowed. The body responds to dimness by softening its vigilance. The heart steadies. Movements become deliberate. So too did the earth. No plea rose from mountains. No cry echoed from fields. Instead, there was waiting, a waiting without tension, as though the world understood something instinctively, that concealment is not annihilation, that light, when withdrawn, still exists somewhere gathered, thinking, preparing. A thin mist began forming at dawn now. It hovered low over valleys, dissolving slowly rather than burning away quickly as it once had. Its presence softened outlines further, blurring the line between ground and sky. In that mist, footsteps seemed quieter, sound carried differently. Even bells at distant shrines rang with deeper tone, their echoes lingering longer in dense air. Within the cave, silence held, and in that held silence, the faintest warmth remained, not radiating outward, but steady and intact. The world did not know when brightness would return. It did not measure the absence. It simply adapted, and in the adaptation, something profound unfolded. Balance was not dependent on constant brilliance. The earth could endure dimness. It could breathe through shadow. It could exist in prolonged dusk without breaking. Light had hidden, but it had not abandoned, and in the quiet between brightness and return, the story deepened, not toward despair, but toward patience. Waiting did not announce itself. It arrived quietly, slipping into the spaces between actions, settling where urgency once lived. The world did not decide to wait. It discovered that it already was. Morning no longer signaled beginning. It arrived without ceremony, pale and restrained. Light filtered through cloud and mist, touching surfaces lightly rather than claiming them. The difference between dawn and midday softened until time felt circular rather than linear. Villages adjusted without instruction. People woke when their bodies felt ready rather than when the sky declared permission. Fires were tended slowly. Meals stretched longer, their warmth valued more than their speed. Hands lingered over cups, over bowls, over the gentle comfort of repetition. The absence of light did not hollow the day. It reshaped it. Across open fields, soil cooled evenly. Moisture lingered longer beneath the surface, nourishing roots that no longer rushed upward. Growth continued, but with restraint. Leaves unfurled wider, drinking what little filtered brightness remained. The earth learned to gather. At the edge of a river, stones darkened as water passed over them endlessly. Their surfaces grew smoother, less reflective, absorbing the dim instead of rejecting it. The river's voice deepened, less lively, more constant. Sound itself seemed to slow. Footsteps softened. Doors closed with care. Even laughter lowered its volume, as though instinctively respecting the new density of the air. Lanterns became markers of presence. They were no longer symbols of celebration or warning. They were companions. Their flames steadied the eye, grounding movement in a world that felt gently unmoored from time. At night, their glow reflected in water like distant stars that had learned to descend. Shadows learned new shapes. They no longer fled from brightness. They settled into corners, beneath eaves, along the bases of trees. They grew longer but not darker, stretching without menace. Children traced them across walls and floors, noticing how slowly they moved now, how patiently they followed. The scale of attention shifted again, from the wide hush of sky to the texture of wood grain to the warmth held inside a single flame. The mind, sensing no threat, softened its grip. Within forests, animals altered their patterns. Some emerged later, others rested longer. No panic spread. The forest reorganized itself around gentler cues. Leaves rustled less sharply. Branches swayed without urgency. The air carried scent more clearly now, damp earth, old bark, faint smoke, without strong sunlight to scatter it. Fragrance lingered. Memory deepened. At the shrine, bells rang less often, not because devotion faded, but because the act of ringing felt heavier in dimness. When they did sound, their tones traveled farther, folding back on themselves in echoes that lingered against stone and wood. The sound did not demand response. It simply existed. Within the cave, the hidden warmth remained unchanged. Light rested without impatience. Its radiance did not diminish further, nor did it gather strength. It remained contained, stable, inward, steady. The stone around it held the temperature evenly, neither cooling nor warming. There was no urgency within concealment. Outside, the world mirrored that steadiness. Clouds thinned and thickened without pattern. Sometimes a faint glow would press through, touching treetops or shrine roofs for a brief moment before withdrawing again. Those moments were noticed, but they were not chased. Waiting did not feel empty. It felt intentional. Time widened further. Days no longer stacked neatly. They blurred gently into one another. Memory of brightness softened, losing its sharp edges. People stopped measuring absence and began inhabiting it. In the evenings, gatherings grew quieter. Stories were told without climax. Movement slowed. Silence was allowed to remain without being filled. The world learned something ancient again, that stillness does not mean nothingness. It means listening. From mountain slopes to valley floors, the same rhythm emerged. Patience, not enforced, chosen. Even weather complied. Rain fell gently, without urgency. It soaked into soil without flooding. It tapped against rooftops with measured consistency, as though aware that the world beneath it was listening closely. When rain ended, it did not leave quickly. Drops clung to leaves. Mist hovered. The ground released scents slowly. At dawn, frost sometimes appeared, faint, temporary. It outlined edges delicately before dissolving back into dampness. No harm followed. The world held balance. Within the cave, stone absorbed faint vibration. The earth itself acknowledged concealment, holding it without strain. There was no pressure to reopen, no internal friction, only rest. The sun goddess remained folded inward, not distant, contained. Above ground, humans sensed something they could not name, a safety in slowness, a permission to pause. No one declared it. It emerged naturally. Movements became intentional, words fewer. Attention sharpened to texture, to tone, to subtle shifts in air. Scale shifted once more. From the collective rhythm of villages to the steady flame of a single lantern to the quiet pulse of breath. Breathing deepened. Without harsh light to sharpen edges, bodies relaxed, shoulders lowered, eyes adjusted to dimness, learning to seek radiance instead of glare. The nervous systems of living things recalibrated. Waiting became a state, not an action. It was not anticipation. It was trust. Trust that light had not vanished. Trust that concealment was temporary. Trust that balance would return in its own rhythm. Within that trust, the world rested. Lanterns burned. Rivers flowed. Mountains stood. Nothing demanded resolution. Nothing rushed toward conclusion. The absence of brilliance did not become despair. It became depth. And in that depth, the world discovered resilience. Not loud or triumphant, but quiet and unbreakable. The waiting did not end, but it settled into shape. A shape the world could hold. The dusk did not end. It stretched. What once would have slipped quietly into night instead remained suspended, as though the sky itself had forgotten the final step of evening. The sunless glow that hovered above the valleys neither brightened nor faded completely. It lingered, thin and patient, resting across land that had already learned how to soften its expectations. From the highest ridges, the view had changed. Mountains that once cut sharply against bright horizons now dissolved gently into layers of shadow, their outlines blurred, not from distance, but from diffused light that refused to sharpen edges. Peaks became suggestions rather than declarations, their forms resting quietly against the sky. Below them, valleys filled with muted color. Fields carried tones of gray-green and deep blue. Rivers reflected a diluted sky, their surfaces broken only by slow current and the occasional widening ripple. Even waters seemed less eager to scatter light, holding what little remained with restraint. The air cooled evenly, not suddenly, not sharply, but gradually, like cloth laid across the skin. The absence of intense warmth allowed temperature to settle into balance. Days no longer climbed and fell. They hovered. Villages adapted further. Roofs gathered moisture more readily now. Thin layers of dew formed and lingered, clinging to tiles and beams. Wooden structures absorbed dampness slowly, releasing faint, earthy scents that carried through narrow streets. Footsteps sounded softer, without sharp light to emphasize movement. Sound itself felt rounded. The echo of steps against stone stretched slightly longer, as if the space between walls had widened. Lanterns glowed before darkness demanded them. They were lit in late afternoon, not to push back night, but to mark presence. Their amber light carved small islands of warmth within the dim, creating points of steadiness rather than illumination. At the edges of those circles, shadow rested comfortably. Inside homes, hands moved deliberately. Cooking slowed. Steam rose gently, hanging longer in air that no longer carried it away quickly. Meals were taken without hurry. Heat from bowls and cups mattered more now, not as urgency, but as comfort. Children noticed the change in sky first. They watched how color refused to deepen, how evenings stayed shallow, as though unfinished. Their questions were few. The world did not feel wrong, only altered. Elders noticed later. They recognized the shift not in sight, but in rhythm. Time had widened. The day felt heavier, longer, yet less demanding. The body no longer rushed to keep pace with brightness. Within forests, trees responded quietly. Leaves adjusted their angle, widening to capture diffused glow. Bark cooled earlier in the day. Sap flowed steadily, unhurried by heat. Birdsong shifted again. Calls stretched farther apart. Some birds sang twice at dawn, uncertain whether light would follow. Others waited longer before committing their voices, listening for cues that no longer arrived reliably. The forest learned patience. Scales shifted gently, from wide valleys beneath a muted sky to the surface of a single leaf holding dew to the thin tremor of light trapped within a lantern flame. Each scale held its own version of dusk. Clouds gathered without drummer. They layered themselves across the sky, thinning and thickening without pattern. At times, a faint brightness pressed through, not enough to restore day, but enough to remind the world of what once filled the sky. Those moments passed without resistance. No one reached for them. Rivers adjusted once more. Their banks softened as moisture lingered. Grass near the water grew thicker, bending under its own weight. Stones beneath, the surface darkened permanently, absorbing the absence of glare. The sound of water deepened further. It carried less sparkle, more body. It spoke of endurance rather than movement. Within Chinese letter, shadows pooled beneath eaves. Ropes hung motionless more often now, stirred only by long, steady currents of air. Wooden floors cooled evenly, their gray more visible without harsh reflection. Visitors lingered without intention. They stood longer, hands resting on railings, eyes adjusting to dimness. Thoughts slowed. Breath matched the pace of surroundings. The bells rang rarely. When they did, their tones traveled farther, carried by air that held sound rather than scattering it. The echoes folded back on themselves, returning softened. Within Chinese letter, concealment remained unchanged. Chinese letter neither pressed outward nor dimmed further. Its presence rested inwardly, contained within stillness that did not feel restrictive. The cavern walls held temperature evenly, stone neither cold nor warm. Silence gathered without weight. Chinese letter remained in quiet suspension, not asleep, not waiting impatiently, existing within inward light, above ground. The world sensed something similar. Waiting no longer felt temporary. It felt inhabitable. Long dusk became the new structure of time. Days did not feel incomplete. They felt spacious. The absence of strong contrast allowed subtle variations to surface, changes in texture, in tone, in scent. Attention shifted again, from sky to valley, from valley to village, from village to breathing deepened naturally, without harsh brightness to sharpen awareness. The body softened its alertness. Muscles relaxed. Eyes learned to see gradients rather than edges. Even thoughts slowed. They drifted rather than leapt. At times, fog gathered low in valleys. It did not rush away at sunrise. It rested, thinning gradually until it became indistinguishable from air. Hills emerged slowly from its embrace, outlines returning gently. The fog carried sound differently. Distant movement felt closer. Near movement softened. Space itself seemed to thicken, holding vibration longer. People learned to move within it. Steps were placed carefully. Voices lowered instinctively. Even laughter softened, as if aware that sound carried farther now. The world was not dim because something was missing. It was dim because something was resting. This understanding did not come as thought. It emerged as sensation. The body felt it. The earth felt it. The sky held it. Long dusk did not demand resolution. It allowed continuity. Plants continued to grow. Animals continued to move. Water continued to flow. Nothing essential had stopped. Only pace had changed. And in that slow pace, balance found new footing. The valleys held their dimness without strain. They learned how to receive light differently. Not in brilliance, but in presence. Above them, the sky remained undecided, neither fully day nor fully night. Just enough light to guide, just enough shadow to rest. And beneath it all, the world settled into prolonged twilight, not waiting anxiously for return, but trusting that when Chinese letter chose to emerge again, it would do so gently. For now, dusk was enough. Rhythm did not disappear with brightness. It changed its shape. What once moved in clear intervals, dawn rising, day unfolding, night closing, softened into a continuous motion that no longer announced itself. The world did not lose its beat. It learned to feel it internally, the way water remembers the pull of tide even when the moon is hidden behind cloud. Across the valleys, work resumed in quieter forms. Fields were tended with slower hands. Tools rested longer between movements. The absence of sharp light allowed attention to drift inward, guiding effort by sensation rather than sight. Soil felt different now, cooler, heavier with moisture. Seeds pressed into it met less resistance. Growth continued. It did not surge. It unfolded. Stems thickened gradually. Leaves widened. Roots traveled deeper rather than faster, following cool pathways beneath the surface. The earth adjusted its priorities, favoring stability over speed. Villages developed new markers of time. Lanterns signaled evening long before darkness claimed the sky. Fires were tended by feel rather than schedule. The warmth of embers became a clock of its own, measured by glow and scent instead of position. People noticed they slept differently. Rest came earlier, deeper. Without strong light to resist it, the body surrendered more easily. Dreams lengthened. Waking felt softer, less abrupt. Breath found its own tempo. Inside homes, the sound of breathing blended with the creak of wood and the faint hiss of flame. The world no longer rushed anyone awake. Outside, animals reorganized their cycles. Nocturnal creatures ventured out earlier, overlapping gently with those that once claimed daylight. There was no conflict. Paths crossed without alarm. The forest layered itself in shared time. Owls rested longer before calling. Deer moved at hours once avoided. Insects adjusted their chorus, spreading sound across longer stretches rather than clustering it into brief intensity. The forest kept rhythm without command. Scale shifted again, from the broad valley held in twilight to the small circle of warmth around a hearth to the pulse beneath a wrist resting on wood. The heart followed. It beat steadily, unconcerned with brightness. Without sharp cues, it relied on internal balance. The body learned that not all guidance comes from the sky. At the shrine, caretakers moved differently. They swept slowly, allowing debris to gather briefly before clearing it away. Offerings were arranged with care rather than haste. The act itself mattered more than timing. The bells rang sparingly. When they did, their sound marked presence rather than moment. The tone rolled outward, touching nearby trees and stone before returning softly to rest. No urgency followed. Rivers demonstrated patience. Their currents did not slow, but their surfaces grew smoother. Without strong light to fracture reflections, water carried a uniform tone, deep, steady, continuous. Pebbles beneath the surface glimmered faintly, visible only when the eye lingered. Movement beneath the water felt more deliberate, fish gliding rather than darting. The sound of flow became a constant companion, not loud enough to demand attention, not quiet enough to disappear. Within the sky, clouds thinned at times. A diluted glow pressed through briefly, touching the land with memory rather than force. Those moments did not restore day. They reminded the world of warmth without insisting upon it. The land accepted them without leaning forward. Mist formed more frequently now. It rose from valleys and riverbanks, gathering gently before spreading thin. It did not retreat quickly. It allowed hills to emerge gradually, their shapes revealing themselves without sharp outline. Within mist, sound traveled farther. A footstep echoed softly. A distant bell lingered. Space itself seemed to widen, holding vibration longer than before. People learned to move within that widened space. They placed steps carefully. They spoke softly. They listened more than they spoke. Waiting no longer felt passive. It felt active in a quiet way, an attentiveness without tension. Within the cave, the inward light remained constant. Light held its shape without flicker. It did not strain against containment. The stone around it felt neither pressure nor heat. The sun goddess remained present without expression, not hidden in fear, not withheld in judgment. Resting, above ground, the world mirrored that rest. The absence of direct warmth allowed subtler warmth to surface. The heat held in stone after rain. The comfort of bodies gathered closer. The steady glow of flame sustained without rush. The rhythm of the world became layered. Daily movement slowed, but deeper cycles continued. Seasons still turned. Growth still progressed. Change still occurred. It simply announced itself more quietly. Scales shifted once more, from the continuity of valleys to the pattern of footsteps returning nightly, to the rise and fall of breath during sleep. Dreams grew fuller. Without abrupt waking, the mind wandered longer. Images unfolded gently, not driven by urgency. Sleep became a landscape rather than a pause. The world, too, slept differently. Night no longer felt like interruption. It blended seamlessly into day, each carrying similar weight. Darkness did not claim the land. It shared it. No one asked when light would return. The question lost relevance. The rhythm held without it, and within that held rhythm, something unexpected emerged, a deeper steadiness than before. The world discovered that its balance was not dependent on constant brilliance. It could sustain itself in dimness. It could move, grow, and rest within shadow. This knowledge did not replace light. It prepared space for it. When light would return, it would not need to prove itself. The world would receive it without clinging, without fear of loss. For now, rhythm was enough. Lanterns burned steadily. Rivers flowed patiently. Breath rose and fell. And beneath a sky that refused to hurry, the sunless world continued. Not in waiting alone, but in quiet, resilient motion. As the prolonged dusk settled deeper into the valleys, shadows began to change. At first, they had simply lengthened. They stretched softly across stone paths and wooden floors, dissolving into one another without resistance. But now they grew steadier. They learned how to hold their form without the sharp authority of the sun. Where once light had defined them with crisp borders, shadow now defined itself. Along the walls of homes, faint gradients replaced harsh lines. Corners filled gradually, not dark but dense, like ink diluted just enough to remain translucent. The absence of brilliance allowed detail to surface within dimness. Grain in wood stood out more clearly. Threads in woven cloth became visible in gentle relief. The world was not losing clarity. It was discovering another kind. Across open hillsides, the silhouettes of trees stabilized against the pale sky. Their branches no longer flickered in contrast. They rested in layered gray and blue, each contour held quietly. Wind moved through them in long currents. Leaves did not flash with reflected glare. They trembled in soft texture, their surfaces matte and receptive. The sound they made changed again, less shimmer, more whisper. The air cooled earlier each day now, but evenly. Temperature did not drop sharply. It descended like a curtain lowered with care. Skin felt it gradually, registering the shift not as chill but as steadiness. Breath left the body more visibly. In the long dusk, exhalations lingered faintly, dissolving slowly before merging with the air. The world seemed to watch them fade. Scale narrowed, from the broad hillside under layered sky to a single branch swaying against gray to the faint condensation of breath. Within villages, lanterns cast new patterns. Their glow no longer competed with brightness outside. It defined space gently, creating halos that merged with shadow rather than cutting into it. Flame edges flickered with subtle variations, small pulses, that revealed the density of surrounding air. Those flickers became part of rhythm. Children watched them before sleep, noticing how each flame leaned slightly before returning upright. They did not count the movement. They observed it. Elders, seated near doorways, sensed something similar. The weight of absence had become familiar. It no longer felt like loss. It felt like atmosphere. At the shrine, shadow gathered beneath the roof beams and lingered there even at midday. Moss-along stone steps deepened in color. Water collected in small basins reflected a sky that remained undecided. When caretakers moved across the courtyard, their forms did not cast sharp replicas behind them. Instead, shadow followed gently, attached but diffused. The bells rang once in the extended dusk. Their sound did not pierce the air. It traveled through it like a ripple in still water. The vibration reached cedar trunks and returned softened. Nothing startled. The world accepted tone as texture. Far from villages, along the river's bend, reeds bent and held their shape longer before rising again. Their silhouettes against muted water appeared solid, not fragile. Water, too, learned to carry shadow, without glare. The river's surface mirrored the sky faithfully, gray merging into gray, current defined by subtle variation rather than sparkle. Beneath it, stones glowed faintly, visible only when gaze lingered. Fish swam in slow arcs. Their movement did not flash, it suggested. The absence of strong contrasted toward them stillness. Within forests, animals adapted further. Paths crossed more frequently now between creatures once divided by day and night. There was no confusion. Instinct adjusted without friction. Owls perched earlier, their outlines blending into bark. Deer stepped into clearings without urgency. Insects layered their sound across longer stretches of time, creating a continuous hum rather than clustered bursts. The forest did not lose voice. It lowered it. Scale shifted again. From the river winding through valley to the curve of a reed to the pulse beneath still water. Within the cave, the inward radiance remained unchanged. Light held its density without fluctuation. It neither dimmed nor expanded. It rested like a coal beneath ash, contained but intact. Stone walls absorbed faint vibration from the world above, yet nothing disturbed the interior balance. The sun goddess remained folded within stillness, not in conflict, not in absence of will, simply withdrawn. Above ground, shadow continued to mature. It no longer relied on light to define it. It found structure in relation to objects, in gradient and texture. People began to notice that they could see more within dimness than before. Eyes adjusted fully now. Subtle distinctions emerged. The difference between fabric and skin, between bark and moss, between stone and soil. The world had not grown darker. Perception had grown deeper. Mist rolled across low ground in early mornings, but it did not scatter quickly. It thinned gradually, revealing shapes beneath in soft succession. Mountains emerged first as faint forms, then as layered ridges. Trees appeared as clusters before resolving into trunks. Revelation became gradual rather than immediate. Wind shifted direction more often now. It moved from valley to ridge and back again, carrying scent with it, damp earth, smoke, pine resin. Without strong sunlight to disperse it, fragrance lingered. The sense of smell sharpened, sound softened, light diffused, texture clarified. The world rotated its senses gently, one replacing the dominance of another. Within homes, footsteps at night no longer startled sleepers. The dimness created continuity between rooms. Doors opened without stark transition. The glow of a single lantern could guide movement without dividing space. Breathing remained steady. Dreams deepened. Without bright interruption, the mind wandered in long arcs. Images unfolded slowly, not forced into shape. Shadow within dreams felt safe. The body, sensing no abruptness, rested fully. Scale narrowed once more. From the village rooflines under twilight to the flame of one lantern to the quiet rise of a chest in sleep. Even the sky learned restraint. Clouds thinned at times but did not part completely. A faint, diluted brightness pressed through and rested briefly on rooftops before dissolving. The world did not lean toward it. It allowed it to pass. Within that allowance, something settled. Shadows had learned to hold shape. They no longer needed brilliance to justify their presence. They existed alongside the muted glow of the sky, forming balance rather than opposition. The earth, in this prolonged dimness, had discovered something ancient. The contrast is not the only way to define form. Gradation can hold structure. Silence can hold sound. Absence can hold presence. Within the cave, the inward warmth remained constant. It was neither restless nor fading. It waited without counting. Above ground, valleys continued in layered twilight. Lanterns burned steadily. Rivers flowed without shimmer. Mountains held their silhouettes against softened sky. Nothing strained toward return. Nothing collapsed into despair. Shadow, once dependent, now stood on its own. And in that standing, balance deepened further. Stillness gained weight without becoming heavy. It settled across the world like a second atmosphere, felt more than seen. Movements continued within it, but they carried a new resistance, subtle, forgiving, as though the air itself asked for deliberation before allowing passage. This was not silence. It was density. Across the valleys, the prolonged dusk pressed gently downward. Hills appeared closer together, their spaces compressed by diffused light. Distances shortened in perception, even as the land itself remained unchanged. Walking felt different now. Footsteps did not echo sharply. They pressed into earth and stone with muted confirmation, as though the ground acknowledged each step before releasing it. Paths were followed more carefully, not from fear, but from awareness. The body adjusted. Muscles softened into movement rather than pushing against it. Shoulders lowered naturally. The pace of walking aligned with breath without conscious effort. Breath became the measure of time. In villages, doors opened and closed with care. Wood no longer snapped against frames. Hinges moved slowly, producing sounds that blended into background rather than cutting through it. Inside homes, light from lanterns stretched farther than before, filling rooms with an even amber tone. Corners lost their sharpness. Shadow gathered there comfortably, not hiding detail but holding it gently. The boundary between illuminated space and dimness blurred, allowing rooms to feel larger than their walls suggested. People lingered more often at thresholds. They stood between inside and outside, hands resting on door frames, eyes adjusting to the same dimness that occupied both spaces. The transition felt seamless. Scale shifted. From the layered valley beneath an undecided sky to the interior of a single room, to the slow rise and fall of breath near a flame. Within the shrine, stillness took on ceremonial presence. The wooden floors cooled evenly. The scent of incense lingered longer after being lit, threading through air that did not hurry to carry it away. Shadows beneath roof beams remained constant throughout the day. Caretakers moved slowly, their sweeping traced deliberate arcs, each motion completing itself before the next began. Dust settled gently rather than scattering, as though even particles respected the new density. When bells rang, their sound pressed outward, then rested. It did not bound sharply, it did not fracture. It held shape as it traveled, arriving at distant points with softened edges. The sound felt substantial, not loud, weighty. Along the river, the water carried stillness differently. Current remained steady, but surface movement smoothed further. Ripples widened and faded slowly, their edges dissolving into the larger body of flow. Stones beneath the surface appeared closer together, magnified by the absence of glare. The water revealed more of its depth without needing clarity. Fish moved with measured intent. Their arcs lengthened, their turns widened. They glided rather than darted, conserving motion in a world that rewarded restraint. The forest absorbed stillness deeply. Trees held their branches without agitation. Leaves shifted occasionally, but without urgency. The wind, when it moved, did so in long, even currents that passed through layers of foliage without interruption. Sound layered itself. The hum of insects stretched across time rather than clustering. Bird calls arrived sporadically, then fell silent again without expectation. The forest did not feel empty. It felt composed. Within the cave, the inward light remained unchanged. Light held its density without radiating outward. It neither expanded nor contracted. The stone around it retained a neutral temperature, holding balance without strain. The sun goddess remained folded inward, not withdrawn in sorrow, not sealed in conflict, resting within containment that did not feel like confinement. Above ground, the world mirrored that inward composure. Stillness carried presence now. It was felt in the way hands rested longer on surfaces, in the way eyes lingered on textures, in the way pauses between actions expanded without discomfort. Time stretched again, not into emptiness, but into availability. Moments felt open rather than fleeting. The absence of sharp contrast allowed attention to settle wherever it landed. Scale narrowed. From the forest edge under gray sky to the surface of bark beneath fingertips to the warmth held inside a single palm. Temperature remained even. Coolness did not deepen into cold. Warmth did not vanish entirely. Instead, the world maintained equilibrium, distributing heat gently rather than concentrating it. Fireplaces and hearths glowed steadily. Embers held their shape longer before dimming. Flames leaned occasionally, responding to slow currents of air. Their light flickered subtly, providing rhythm without demand. People slept more deeply. Night no longer felt like interruption. It blended into day without clear border. Sleep arrived without resistance, and waking did not feel abrupt. Dreams unfolded slowly. Images did not collide or fragment. They drifted, guided by the same stillness that shaped the waking world. The mind did not rush to resolve them. The body rested fully. Outside, fog formed more often now, particularly near water. It rolled gently across ground and lingered without urgency. Hills emerged gradually as it thinned, their outlines soft and patient. Sound moved differently within it. A distant step arrived closer than expected. A bell's echo stretched longer before fading. Space itself seemed to hold vibration longer. People adjusted their voices instinctively. Speech lowered in volume. Words were chosen carefully, not from fear, but from awareness that sound carried weight now. The world did not feel fragile. It felt attentive. Stillness had become substantial. It was no longer the absence of action. It was the presence of restraint. Within that restraint, balance deepened. The prolonged dusk did not weaken the world. It strengthened it quietly. Within the cave, the inward warmth remained stable. No signal pressed outward. No crack formed in concealment. The contained light rested with patience that did not measure time. Above, clouds shifted slowly, sometimes thinning, sometimes gathering. The sky did not decide to clear or darken. It remained suspended, allowing the land beneath it to adapt without pressure. The earth accepted the weight of stillness. It did not push against it. It leaned into it. Lanterns burned. Rivers flowed. Forests held their breath between movements. Nothing strained toward return. Nothing asked for explanation. Stillness had weight now, but it was a weight the world could carry, and in carrying it, the world grew quieter, steadier, and more prepared for whatever might come next. The memory of warmth did not vanish when brightness withdrew. It lingered quietly, held within surfaces and habits, carried by stone and wood long after the sky stopped offering it freely. The world remembered what it had once received, and that memory softened the absence. Morning arrived pale and steady. The air carried a faint coolness that did not deepen into chill. Instead, it rested against the skin like fabric laid gently over the shoulders. Breath moved easily within it, neither sharpened nor slowed by temperature. Across the valleys, the land held this balance carefully. Fields no longer shimmered beneath direct radiance, but their soil retained warmth beneath the surface. When hands pressed into it, they felt a mild resistance, not cold, but density. The earth had learned to store what it was given. Stones along paths carried the same memory. They no longer warmed quickly, but they did not feel lifeless. Touch revealed a neutral steadiness, as though heat had settled inward rather than vanished. Walking across them felt grounding. Scale shifted. From the open valley beneath the softened sky to the surface of a stone beneath a palm to the warmth held quietly in contact. Villages moved within this remembered warmth. Homes retained it longest. Wooden beams absorbed heat slowly and released it even more slowly. Paper screens filtered pale light, diffusing it gently into interior spaces. Inside, the air felt calmer, not warmed by sunlight, but steadied by enclosure. Fires were tended carefully, not to fight cold, but to maintain equilibrium. The glow of embers mattered more now than the height of flame. People gathered closer, not from need, but from instinct. Bodies shared warmth naturally, seated nearer, moving less. The distance between individuals shortened without being noticed. Speech softened, voices lowered, not because sound carried farther, but because the atmosphere encouraged restraint. Words were chosen deliberately. Silence was allowed to settle without pressure. Within the shrine, warmth lingered in wood and stone. Steps that once felt cool beneath bare feet now carried a gentle neutrality. The scent of aged timber and moss blended into something steady and familiar. Offerings rested quietly. No urgency surrounded them. They remained where placed, held within shadow that felt protective rather than obscuring. Caretakers paused often, their movements slowed, guided by sensation rather than schedule. They lingered near pillars, near altars, allowing stillness to complete itself before moving on. The bells rang rarely. When they did, their sound carried a roundness that suggested memory rather than signal. The tone did not demand response. It reminded. Beyond villages, rivers carried warmth differently. Their surfaces no longer scattered heat outward, but the water beneath retained a stable temperature. Fish moved comfortably, their paths unhurried. The current held them gently, neither urging nor resisting. When hands touched the water, it felt alive, not warm, not cold, balanced. Reeds along the banks leaned into this equilibrium. Their stalks bent and returned without strain. Dew formed and lingered, evaporating slowly in air that did not rush to reclaim moisture. Mist rose frequently now. It carried the faint scent of earth and water, holding it close. As it drifted, it softened the memory of warmth further, wrapping it in layers of air. The sky above remained undecided. Clouds thinned and gathered without pattern. Occasionally, a diluted glow pressed through, touching rooftops and treetops briefly before withdrawing again. Those moments did not restore warmth. They acknowledged it. The world did not reach for them. It allowed them to pass. Within forests, warmth lived differently. It resided in bark, in fallen leaves, in the spaces between roots. The forest floor remained active, decomposition continuing slowly, generating subtle heat beneath layers of dampness. When animals rested there, they felt it. Bodies settled into ground that supported them without drawing warmth away. Sleep came easily, unbroken by cold. Birds perched longer before moving, feathers fluffed just enough to hold balance. Their calls remained sparse, arriving only when necessary. The forest held its temperature evenly. Scales shifted again. From the forest canopy beneath gray sky to the texture of bark beneath fingers to the warmth held inside a resting body. Within the cave, the inward radiance remained unchanged. Light rested without movement, contained but intact. It did not press outward, but its presence shaped the space around it subtly, like gravity shaping stone over time. The cavern walls held this influence evenly. They neither cooled nor warmed further. They remained neutral, steady, patient. The sun goddess remained within this inward stillness, not distant, not unreachable, present without outward expression. Above ground, the world sensed this presence as memory rather than force. Warmth appeared in unexpected places, in the steam rising from a bowl, in the breath shared between bodies, in the lingering heat of a hand resting against another. It was no longer imposed by sky. It was cultivated. Time adjusted accordingly. Without strong heat to drive urgency, action slowed. Tasks were completed fully rather than quickly. The world favored completion over speed. Days no longer felt short. They felt sufficient. Night arrived without abruptness. Darkness deepened slightly. But it did not overwhelm. Lanterns marked space gently. Their glow reflected off surfaces that remembered warmth, enhancing comfort rather than contrast. Sleep arrived more deeply now. Body surrendered to rest without resistance. The mind followed, drifting into images shaped by softness rather than intensity. Dreams carried warmth differently. They did not burn brightly. They glowed steadily, unfolding without urgency. The world rested within this remembered warmth. It did not long for return. It trusted that what had once been given was not gone. Within that trust, balance deepened further. Lanterns burned steadily. Rivers flowed patiently. Forests breathed evenly. Above them, the sky continued its hesitation. Within the cave, the inward light remained, and between absence and return, the world learned something profound. Warmth does not belong solely to the sky. It can be held, remembered, shared. What the sky no longer offered, the world learned to carry. This was not a burden taken up suddenly. It was a quiet redistribution, a sharing of balance across stone, water, wood, and breath. Warmth did not disappear when brightness withdrew. It changed hands. Across the valleys, the ground accepted responsibility first. Soil that once warmed easily beneath the sun now held heat deeper, closer to its core. During the long dusk, it released that stored warmth slowly, evenly, sustaining roots and insects that moved beneath the surface. Growth continued, not in visible bursts, but in steady, reliable increments. Fields no longer signaled their progress outwardly. They advanced inward. Plants widened their leaves and deepened their roots, gathering what little diffused light remained and relying more on the steadiness of earth beneath them. The surface appeared subdued, but life beneath it remained active. Walking across these fields felt different. Footsteps pressed into ground that responded gently, absorbing weight without resistance. The earth felt present, supportive, carrying what the sky withheld without complaint. Scales shifted. From the wide valley under a hesitant sky to the soil compressing beneath a foot to the warmth traveling quietly upward. Villages mirrored this adaptation. Homes became centers of balance. Walls absorbed heat during cooking and retained it long afterward. Fires were tended carefully, not allowed to burn high, but maintained at a steady glow that warmed without excess. The arrangement of space changed subtly. People gathered closer to hearths, to one another, to shared warmth. The spaces between bodies narrowed without being noticed. Touch lingered longer, a hand resting on a shoulder, fingers brushing fabric. These gestures carried more meaning now, not because they replaced something lost, but because they had room to be felt. Within kitchens, steam rose slowly. It clung to air that no longer rushed to disperse it. Scents layered themselves, grain, broth, smoke lingering longer than before. The act of preparing food became an exchange of warmth rather than a task. Meals stretched. They were not hurried. Bowls were held longer between hands. Heat was savored, not consumed quickly. Voices softened around these gatherings. Speech slowed, allowing pauses to exist without discomfort. Silence found its place between words, holding meaning rather than absence. Within the shrine, the redistribution of warmth was felt clearly. Stone steps cooled evenly, but did not draw heat away sharply. Wooden beams retained a gentle neutrality. The air beneath the roof held steadiness, unaffected by the sky's hesitation. Offerings rested quietly, not warmed by sun, but held within protected space. The absence of direct brightness gave them a sense of permanence, as though time had loosened its grip. Caretakers moved deliberately. Their hands rested longer on surfaces. Their breath matched their steps. The work of maintenance became an act of balance rather than routine. The bells rang infrequently. When they did, their sound felt weighted, not sharp. It rolled outward, touching stone and tree before returning softly. The tone carried warmth of memory rather than signal. Beyond villages, rivers accepted their share. Water that once flashed with reflected light now carried warmth beneath its surface. Currents moved steadily, maintaining temperature through depth rather than exposure. When animals entered the river, they did not recoil. The water felt stable. Fish glided through layers of dim reflection, their bodies moving within temperature that did not shock. The river supported them quietly, holding what the sky withheld. Along the banks, reeds and grasses thickened. They bent under moisture and returned slowly. Dew collected and lingered, evaporating only after long intervals. The air held humidity gently, distributing warmth evenly. Mist rose more frequently now. It carried heat in diluted form, spreading it across ground and leaf. As it drifted, it softened transitions between spaces, blending earth and sky. The forest absorbed warmth deeply. Fallen leaves layered the ground, insulating it. Decomposition continued beneath, generating subtle heat that rose slowly. The forest floor became a reservoir, supporting roots and insects through extended dimness. Animals nested closer to ground. They slept longer, bodies pressed into soil that held balance. Movement remained deliberate, conserving warmth rather than expending it. Birds fluffed their feathers minimally, relying on shared air rather than sun. Their calls remained sparse, conserving energy within a world that rewarded restraint. Scale shifted again, from the river winding through shadowed land to the forest floor beneath leaves to the steady warmth inside a resting body within the cave. The inward light remained unchanged. Light rested without urgency. It neither expanded nor diminished. The stone around it absorbed influence evenly, holding balance without strain. The sun goddess remained contained within stillness, not withholding warmth, allowing it to be shared elsewhere. Above ground, the world understood this intuitively. Warmth appeared in places once overlooked, in the pressure of a blanket, in the proximity of bodies, in the steady glow of embers that refused to flare. These forms of warmth did not demand attention. They supported life quietly. Time adapted further. Without strong light to mark urgency, the world moved by internal cues: hunger, fatigue, comfort. These became the measures of action. Days no longer competed with one another. They unfolded. Night arrived without tension. Darkness deepened slightly, but it did not overwhelm. Lanterns marked space gently. Their glow interacted with warmth held in walls and floors, amplifying comfort rather than contrast. Sleep came easily. The body accepted rest without resistance. Dreams carried the same steadiness as waking life, unfolding without intensity. The world rested within this redistribution. Nothing strained toward return. Nothing felt incomplete. The absence of direct warmth from the sky had revealed something enduring, that balance does not rely on a single source. It can be shared, held, carried. Lanterns burned steadily. Rivers flowed patiently. Forests breathed evenly. Above them, the sky continued its hesitation. Within the cave, the inward light remained, and between concealment and return, the world learned how to sustain itself, not by replacing what was withheld, but by remembering how to hold it together. Night no longer arrived as a clear boundary. It settled gradually, folding itself into the already muted world without announcing its presence. The sky dimmed by degrees so subtle they were felt more than seen, until what had once been dusk became something deeper, broader, and more encompassing. This was not darkness as absence. It was darkness as shelter. Across the valleys, the long night rested gently on the land. Hills and forests did not vanish beneath it. They remained present, their forms softened rather than erased. The contours of the earth grew quieter, less insistent, as though they no longer needed to prove their shape. Stars appeared rarely now. When they did, they seemed distant and restrained, peeking through thin gaps in cloud before withdrawing again. Their light did not scatter widely. It rested where it landed, small and contained. The moon, too, peered less often. When it emerged, it did so faintly, its surface dulled by layers of haze. Its presence felt symbolic rather than directive, a reminder rather than a guide. The world adjusted to this long night without resistance. Villages glowed softly from within. Lanterns and hearths defined space gently, their light pooling rather than spreading. Streets were not illuminated so much as suggested, their paths known by memory and touch. Footsteps found their way without sight. Hands brushed walls. Fingers traced familiar grain in wood. The body navigated by feel, trusting spaces it had learned well. Inside homes, the night felt complete. Rooms filled with steady amber glow. Shadows rested along edges without encroaching. The boundary between light and dark softened until it no longer divided, only layered. People spoke less, not because silence was required, but because it felt sufficient. Words emerged only when needed, and when they did, they carried weight without volume. Listening became primary. The crackle of embers, the shift of breath, the distant movement of wind against walls. These sounds did not interrupt silence. They completed it. Scale shifted. From the wide valley under starless sky to the interior of a single home, to the faint sound of breathing near sleep. The body responded. Muscles relaxed more fully at night now. Without sharp cues to remain alert, tension dissolved naturally. Shoulders lowered, hands unclenched. Sleep arrived earlier and lingered longer. Dreams unfolded slowly, their images muted and cohesive. They did not startle. They carried the same density as waking life, wrapped in stillness. Outside, animals moved carefully. Nocturnal creatures shared the night with those once bound to day. Paths overlapped without conflict. Movement was deliberate, conserving energy in a world that rewarded patience. Owls perched silently, their outlines barely visible against darkened bark. Foxes moved along forest edges with measured steps, pausing often to listen rather than act. Insects layered their sound thinly across the night. Their chorus did not swell or fade dramatically. It held a steady presence, a soft vibration beneath awareness. The forest held silence deeply. Trees did not creak as much now. Their trunks had cooled evenly, releasing stored warmth slowly. Leaves rested against one another without agitation. Wind moved through branches in long, gentle currents, producing sound that felt distant even when close. Rivers continued their flow. In the long night, water appeared darker, its surface absorbing what little light remained. The current moved quietly, carrying reflection inward rather than outward. Standing near the river felt grounding. The sound of flow did not demand attention. It reassured. Mist rose frequently from the water. It drifted low, hugging the surface before spreading into surrounding fields. It carried coolness without cold, moisture without heaviness. When it touched skin, it felt like breath. Scales shifted again, from the river winding through darkness to the mist rising gently to the sensation of cool air against skin. Within the shrine, night felt complete rather than empty. Lanterns were kept low. Their glow brushed against pillars and steps, revealing texture rather than form. Shadows pooled beneath eaves, holding space quietly. The bells remained silent most nights. Their absence did not feel like loss. It felt like restraint. When caretakers passed through the grounds, their movements were careful, their steps measured. They paused often, not to observe, but to allow the space to remain undisturbed. The shrine rested within the cave. The inward light remained unchanged. Light held steady within containment, neither pressing outward nor dimming further. It existed as presence rather than illumination. The stone around it felt dense and calm, shaped by ages of patience. The cavern did not echo. It absorbed. The sun goddess remained within this stillness, not waiting in anticipation, not turning away in refusal, resting in balance. Above ground, the world sensed the depth of night as weight rather than threat. The long night did not collapse into fear. It invited introspection. Thoughts slowed further. Without bright light to scatter them, they drifted inward. Concerns softened. The mind released urgency, allowing images to pass without attachment. Even memory changed. Past brightness no longer felt distant or painful. It felt integrated, part of the world's rhythm rather than something withheld. The long night did not demand hope. It allowed acceptance. Scale narrowed once more. From the breadth of night across the valley to the warmth beneath blankets to the steady rhythm of a sleeping heart. Time stretched. Hours passed without being counted. Night and rest blended seamlessly. Waking occurred gently, without abrupt transition. Morning, when it came, did not dispel the night completely. It softened it. Pale light filtered through haze, touching surfaces lightly before retreating again. The long night loosened its grip without leaving. The world learned that night, too, could be inhabited. It was not an interval to endure. It was a state to occupy. Lanterns burned steadily. Rivers flowed quietly. Forests held their breath between movements. Above them, the sky remained subdued. Within the cave, the inward light continued to rest. And beneath the long night, the world discovered a deeper form of silence, one that did not erase sound, but held it gently, allowing everything to exist without urgency. Absence settled into the world like a second skin. It no longer felt like something missing. It felt like a space made available, a hollow that held rather than emptied. The long night deepened, not by growing darker, but by becoming more complete. Darkness no longer pressed. It rested. Across the valleys, landforms grew familiar within dimness. Hills no longer disappeared at night. Their outlines remained present, softened but steady, as though the earth itself had learned to keep its shape without relying on illumination. Paths were remembered by the feet. Stone steps felt known beneath soles. Earth yielded gently where it always had. Movement no longer required sight. It relied on familiarity, on trust in space that had been walked many times before. This trust spread quietly. Villages moved with an absence, as if within a room whose lights had been dimmed but not extinguished. Doors opened without hesitation. Hands reached for tools without searching. Life continued without interruption. Inside homes, the long night felt enclosing rather than isolating. Walls held warmth. Shadows gathered in corners without encroaching. The glow of embers painted ceilings and beams with soft, shifting lights that never startled the eye. People rested deeper now. Sleep arrived without resistance and remained unbroken. Dreams drifted slowly, shaped by the same density that held waking hours. The boundary between sleeping and waking softened, allowing both to exist without conflict. Breathing grew heavier and slower. The body recognized safety. Scales shifted. From the valley settled beneath night to the interior of a home, to the slow rhythm of breath near sleep. Outside, animals moved with confidence. The long night no longer disrupted their patterns. It supported them. Creatures navigated without urgency, pausing often to listen, to sense rather than act. Foxes rested longer between movements. Deer stood still for extended moments, bodies relaxed rather than tense. Insects maintained a low, continuous hum that did not swell or fade dramatically. The forest felt contained. Trees held their branches quietly. Leaves rested against one another, dampened by moisture that lingered in air that did not rush to disperse it. The scent of earth and bark deepened, grounding the senses. Mist became a frequent companion. It settled low and stayed. It did not obscure so much as soften, wrapping the land in a gentle veil. Hills emerged from it gradually, their presence announced without sharp contrast. Sound behaved differently within it. Distant movement felt closer. Near movements softened. Space itself felt smaller, more intimate. People lowered their voices instinctively, not from caution, but from awareness that sound carried weight now. Words traveled farther and lingered longer. Silence felt substantial. Within the shrine, absence gathered with reverence. The grounds rested beneath dim light. Lanterns were kept low, their glow touching stone and wood without illuminating fully. Shadows pooled beneath eaves, holding space respectfully. Caretakers moved slowly. They paused often, allowing the space to remain undisturbed. Their footsteps blended into the ground rather than announcing themselves. The bells remained silent. Their stillness did not feel like neglect. It felt appropriate. Within the shrine, absence felt intentional, a choice rather than a condition. Beyond the village edges, rivers flowed quietly. Their surfaces absorbed the night, reflecting little. The current moved steadily beneath, carrying water forward without surface display. Standing near the river brought calm. The sound of flow reassured without demanding attention. It confirmed continuity. Mist rose from the water and drifted outward, spreading coolness evenly across the land. It did not chill. It balanced. Scale shifted again. From the river winding through night to the mist touching grass to the sensation of cool air against skin. Within the cave, the inward light remained unchanged. Light did not stir. It did not dim further. It did not press outward. It rested. The cavern walls absorbed the stillness fully. Stone held the quiet without echo, without pressure. The sun goddess remained within containment that did not feel like enclosure, resting above ground. The world reflected this rest. Absence no longer carried uncertainty. It carried assurance. The long night had proven itself inhabitable. The world had learned that not everything unseen is unsafe, that not all darkness hides danger, that absence can be shelter. Memory of brightness softened further. It no longer felt like something waiting to return. It felt integrated, part of the world's rhythm rather than its goal. Warmth appeared in subtle forms, in the steady pressure of blankets, in the shared space between bodies, in the slow glow of embers that refused to fade quickly. These forms did not replace light. They sustained life. Time loosened its grip further. Hours passed without being counted. Night and rest merged seamlessly. Morning, when it arrived, did not break the night fully. It thinned it. Pale light filtered through haze, touching surfaces gently before retreating again. The long night remained present, softened but intact. The world did not resist this. It accepted layered existence. Absence and presence coexisted without struggle. Scale narrowed once more. From the long night covering valleys to the quiet interior of a sleeping body to the steady rhythm of a heart. Within this rhythm, safety settled. No signal announced return. No sign was demanded. The world no longer waited for light. It rested within its absence. Lanterns burned steadily. Rivers flowed quietly. Forests held their breath between movements. Above them, the sky remained subdued. Within the cave, the inward light continued to rest. And beneath the long night, the world discovered that absence, when allowed to settle, could become shelter, a space where life slowed, softened, and endured without strain. The change did not arrive as light. It arrived as a thinning, not of darkness itself, but of its weight. The long night remained across the valleys, yet something within it loosened, as though the air, once dense and layered, had exhaled slightly. The sky did not brighten, it softened. Clouds that had long hovered in steady formation drifted farther apart, not revealing blue or gold, but allowing a faint translucence to emerge between them. It was subtle enough to be missed by hurried eyes, yet in a world that had slowed, it was felt. Across the hills, outlines appeared marginally clearer, not sharp, never sharp, but less diffused. The edges of trees stood with slightly more definition against the muted sky. Valleys carried a hint of depth that had not been present days before. The land did not react. It continued its rhythm. Rivers flowed as they always had, steady and restrained. Forests breathed in long intervals. Villages moved without urgency. Yet beneath these continuities, a quiet shift settled. The air felt lighter against the skin. Coolness remained, but its texture changed. It no longer pressed evenly downward. It lifted gently, as though inviting movement rather than encouraging rest. Breath responded. Inhalations lengthened by a fraction. Exhalations carried a faint warmth that lingered less heavily in the air. Scale shifted. From the layered sky above the valley to the line of a single treetop to the breath moving quietly through lungs. Within homes, lantern flames behaved differently. They flickered slightly higher at times, leaning toward unseen currents. The change was delicate, not enough to alarm, only enough to suggest that air moved differently now. Embers glowed a shade brighter before settling again. People noticed without naming it. Hands paused above hearths. Eyes lingered on flames a moment longer. There was no expectation attached to the observation, only awareness. Outside misbehaved differently. It still gathered at dawn, rising from rivers and low fields, but it thinned more quickly. Hills emerged sooner from its embrace. Shapes revealed themselves without lingering behind veils as long as before. The change was gradual, almost hesitant. In forests, leaves responded subtly. Their surfaces, long matte beneath diffused sky, carried faint glimmers when moisture collected upon them. Dew refracted pale light in delicate arcs that vanished quickly, but left the impression of movement. Birdsong shifted again. Calls arrived slightly earlier in the dim morning, not louder, not more frequent, simply earlier. The forest did not stir abruptly. It inhaled. Scale narrowed. From the forest canopy beneath thinning cloud to the surface of dew trembling on a leaf to the faint pulse within a resting hand. Within the shrine, the grounds felt marginally altered. Stone steps cooled less deeply during night. Wood retained warmth a little longer into morning. Shadows beneath eaves remained, but their density felt less absolute. Caretakers sensed the shift not in sight, but in sensation. The air moved across skin with lighter touch. Sound traveled differently, slightly clearer, less absorbed by thickness. When a bell rang one early morning, its tone carried with surprising purity. It did not pierce the air. It rang cleanly. The echo returned sooner than expected. No one interpreted this as signal. It was simply observed. Beyond villages, rivers reflected a faint gradation that had not been present before. The surface carried a subtle layering, not brightness, but nuance. Fish moved nearer the surface for brief intervals, testing depth before descending again. Their movement did not break rhythm, it suggested curiosity. Along the banks, reeds straightened more quickly after bending. Wind moved in narrow currents, less evenly distributed. At times it brushed one side of the valley more strongly than the other, creating small asymmetries that resolved slowly. These irregularities remained gentle. Nothing snapped, nothing surged. Within the cave, the inward light remained steady. Light did not expand, it did not push against stone, yet the space around it felt subtly different, less compressed, more spacious. The cavern walls absorbed the same quiet warmth, but the stillness within them seemed to breathe more freely. The sun goddess remained contained within balance, resting, but the containment no longer felt sealed. Above ground, the world sensed this loosening, not as promise, not as return, as readiness. The long night did not dissolve, it thinned. Morning carried slightly more distinction from evening. Day and night, long blurred together, began to hint at separation, not division, but individuality. Shadows held shape, yet they did not press as deeply into corners. Lanterns burned as before, but their glow seemed to extend a fraction farther. People continued to sleep deeply, yet waking arrived with marginally clearer awareness. Eyes opened without strain. Thoughts assembled more smoothly. The world did not accelerate. It adjusted. Scales shifted once more. From the sky stretching quietly above valleys to the line where hill met mist to the subtle warmth in a single exhale. Animals sensed it first. Deer lifted their heads more frequently, not from alarm, but from alertness. Birds tested longer notes in their calls. Insects shifted their hum into slightly varied patterns, exploring new intervals. The forest remained calm, but beneath calm, motion prepared itself. Mist no longer lingered until midday. It dissolved earlier, revealing textures sooner. Bark patterns became visible in dim light. Moss shimmered faintly with moisture. The air felt less dense. It moved through branches with more definition. Within homes, doors opened more readily at dawn. People stepped outside earlier, not in response to brightness, but to clarity. The world felt marginally more spacious, as though distance had widened between objects. The valleys did not brighten, they deepened. Contrast remained gentle. Light, when it filtered through thinning cloud, carried slightly more warmth, not enough to heat, only enough to remind. The memory of brightness stirred faintly within stone and wood, not as longing, as recognition. Within the cave, the inward radiance held steady, yet something within its stillness shifted, not outward, inward, as though light, long resting, had drawn one quiet breath. The stone around it did not crack, the cavern did not tremble. The shift was internal, subtle as mist thinning at dawn. Above ground, the world continued its rhythm. Lanterns burned, rivers flowed, forests breathed, but beneath the still skies, a quiet change unfolded, not visible enough to declare, not strong enough to alter balance, only enough to suggest that concealment had reached its fullness, and in that fullness, readiness gathered. The separation did not arrive as contrast, it arrived as distinction. For a long time, day and night had shared the same weight. Their boundaries softened until they felt like variations of a single state. Now, without brightness asserting itself, the two began to lean gently apart, not as opposites, but as companions rediscovering their own shapes. Morning carried a slightly clearer tone, not brighter, not warmer, only more defined. The air at dawn felt marginally different from the air at dusk. It lifted more readily from the ground, thinning mist sooner, allowing valleys to reveal themselves in layers rather than all at once. This difference was delicate enough to be felt only by those who lingered. Across the hills, outlines settled into quieter clarity. Trees stood with slightly firmer presence against the sky. Their branches no longer dissolved entirely into haze. They held form without demanding attention. The sky remained muted. Clouds drifted slowly, still covering much of its surface, but they allowed light to filter through in narrower bands. These bands did not illuminate broadly. They touched selectively. A slope here, a river bend there, and then moved on. The land accepted this without reaction. Fields continued their steady growth. Villages moved within their familiar rhythm. Rivers flowed without interruption. Yet beneath these continuities, the world felt more articulated. Breath responded first. In the early hours, inhalations felt slightly cooler. Exhalations carried warmth that dissipated more quickly. The body registered this not as temperature change, but as timing. Morning felt distinct. Scale shifted. From the valley beneath layered cloud to the line of frost thinning on grass to the sensation of breath moving through the chest. Mist still formed at night. It rose quietly from rivers and low ground, gathering in shallow layers. But now it began to thin earlier, loosening its hold before the day fully unfolded. Hills emerged more confidently. Their shapes appeared in stages, base first, then slope, then crest. The process felt intentional, as though the land itself chose how to reveal itself. Within forests, light moved differently. It filtered through leaves in faint streaks. Not enough to cast shadows, but enough to create variation. Bark caught subtle highlights. Moss glimmered briefly before settling back into matte green. Birdsong followed this distinction. Calls arrived earlier and lingered longer, not louder, not urgent, simply more assured. Birds tested intervals, allowing sound to carry through air that felt less dense. The forest listened. Scale narrowed. From the canopy, beneath softened sky to the curve of a branch holding dew to the brief shimmer before it vanished. Within villages, daily patterns adjusted almost imperceptibly. Doors opened slightly earlier. Fires were tended with renewed attentiveness. Lanterns were extinguished a little later in the morning, not because darkness lingered, but because light no longer felt uniform. The distinction mattered. People noticed it without comment. Hands paused near doorways. Eyes lingered on the sky. The world felt marginally more spacious, as though time itself had separated into clearer intervals. Within the shrine, the grounds reflected this subtle articulation. Stone steps cooled overnight but regained neutrality sooner after dawn. Wooden beams held warmth a little more visibly. Shadows beneath eaves remained, but they receded slightly, allowing texture to emerge. When a bell rang in early morning, its tone felt different from the same bell rung in evening. The difference was not volume, it was resonance. Sound traveled with clear intention, returning less absorbed by air. No interpretation followed. It was simply felt. Beyond the village, rivers reflected this separation quietly. Morning water carried faint gradations, lighter near the surface, deeper beneath. Evening water felt heavier, holding shadow more completely. Fish responded. They lingered nearer the surface during early hours, then descended gradually as day softened back toward dusk. Their movement followed rhythm rather than light. Along the banks, reeds adjusted. They stood slightly straighter in the morning, bending more readily in evening wind. The difference was subtle yet consistent. Wind itself learned variation. It moved in narrower paths during morning, brushing specific slopes and valleys. In evening, it spread more evenly, settling into long currents that wrapped the land. The world felt composed of layers again. Within the cave, the inward light remained steady. Light did not shift outward, but the space around it felt more articulated, as though the stillness had found clearer boundaries. The cavern was absorbed quiet without compression, holding balance comfortably. The sun goddess remained within containment, not preparing to emerge, not resisting emergence, resting within readiness. Above ground, the land mirrored this readiness, not as anticipation, as clarity. Day and night no longer merged completely. They leaned apart gently, allowing space between them. That space did not demand filling. It allowed breath. Scale shifted again, from the sky dividing itself into tone to the valley emerging from mist to the quiet awareness of waking. People slept deeply still, but waking felt more distinct. Eyes opened with less heaviness, thoughts assembled without strain. The body rose with quiet assurance rather than inertia. Night still returned without drama. Darkness deepened gently. Lanterns were lit not in response to fear, but to mark transition. Evening carried its own weight again, separate from morning. The long night had not ended. It had differentiated. Animals sensed this clearly. Nocturnal creatures moved later into night. Diurnal ones tested earlier movement. Their paths crossed briefly before settling into distinct rhythms again. There was no conflict, only adjustment. The forest reorganized itself. Sound patterns shifted subtly. Insects adjusted intervals. Birds chose clearer times to call. The air responded. It held sound differently at different hours now. Morning's sound carried farther. Evening's sound softened sooner. Temperature followed suit. Coolness lingered longer at night. Warmth surfaced faintly during day. Neither dominated. Balance held. Within villages, this separation was welcomed without ceremony. People found comfort in renewed rhythm. The world felt less suspended, more gently structured. Time regained its curve, not urgency, shape. Within the cave, the inward light remained unchanged, yet its stillness now felt purposeful, complete, as though concealment had accomplished what it needed to accomplish. Above ground, the sky did not clear, brightness did not return, but distinction had arrived. Day knew itself again. Night remembered its depth. Between them, the world breathed more freely. Lanterns burned, rivers flowed. Forests adjusted their cadence. Nothing rushed forward, nothing clung backward. The separation remained soft, reversible, patient, and beneath still skies, the world stood balanced between what had been withheld and what would one day return, not waiting anxiously, but ready. Light did not arrive as an event. It did not break the sky open, nor did it spill across the land with insistence. It entered quietly, as though it had always been present and simply chose, at last, to be noticed again. The sky remained subdued. Clouds still covered most of its breadth, drifting in pale layers that softened everything beneath them. Yet within those layers, something subtle shifted, a thinning that allowed more distinction, more variation, without revealing brightness outright. Morning carried a different weight now. It was not warmer, but it felt less enclosed. The air lifted more easily from the ground, allowing space to open between earth and sky. Breath moved freely, no longer pressing against density. Across the valleys, the land responded without urgency. Hills emerged with quieter clarity. Their slopes carried gentle gradations, no longer dissolving fully into haze. Trees held their silhouettes with ease, branches visible without being emphasized. Nothing gleamed, nothing flashed. And yet, the world felt more awake. Scales shifted. From the sky holding pale layers to the crest of a distant hill to the sensation of air moving lightly across skin. Light touched surfaces indirectly. It filtered through cloud and mist, arriving softened and scattered. When it reached stone or wood, it did not reflect sharply. It rested. The effect was subtle enough to be mistaken for imagination. But the world, long attentive to small changes, felt it clearly. Morning mist thinned sooner. It still gathered at night, rising from rivers and low fields, but it loosened its hold earlier in the day. Valleys revealed themselves in stages, the forms appearing without hesitation. Dew evaporated quietly. Leaves that once held moisture until late morning now released it sooner, sending faint coolness into the air. The process did not accelerate life. It clarified it. Within forests, this quiet touch of light revealed texture. Bark patterns became more legible. Moss showed variation in depth and tone. Fallen leaves reflected faint gradations that suggested dimension rather than brightness. Birdsong responded gently. Calls lengthened. Notes carried farther, not because they were louder, but because the air held them differently. Sound traveled with intention now, finding paths through space without being absorbed immediately. The forest did not stir dramatically. It acknowledged. Scale narrowed. From the forest canopy, under softened sky to a patch of moss catching diffused light to the warmth in a single breath. Within villages, the change arrived through habit rather than sight. People stepped outside earlier, drawn by clarity rather than brightness. Doors opened without hesitation. Faces lifted briefly toward the sky, then returned to familiar tasks. Lanterns were extinguished slightly earlier, not because darkness had retreated fully, but because their glow felt less necessary. The air itself carried enough presence to define space. Fires were tended with the same care as before, but embers seemed to respond differently now, holding glow with greater steadiness. Homes felt more spacious, not larger, lighter. Walls still held warmth, but they no longer needed to compensate as fully for the sky. The memory of brightness stirred faintly within wood and stone. Within the shrine, the grounds reflected this quiet shift clearly. Stone steps revealed subtle textures long softened by shadow. Wooden beams carried faint gradations where light brushed them gently. Shadows beneath eaves remained, but they no longer pressed as deeply. When caretakers moved through the courtyard, their forms carried clearer outlines, not sharp, defined. The bells rang once in the mid-morning. Their tone traveled with unexpected clarity, rolling outward without being absorbed fully by air. The echo returned sooner, lighter, as though space itself had loosened its hold. No one marked this as sign. It was simply present. Beyond villages, rivers reflected this unannounced light in layers. The surface carried gentle variation, later where cloud thinned, deeper where it gathered. Water moved steadily, but its depth felt more visible. Fish rose briefly toward the surface, testing clarity before descending again. Their movement remained calm, unhurried. Along the banks, reeds held themselves differently. They bent and returned with smoother arcs, responding to wind that carried less density. The air brushed them rather than pressing. Wind itself felt lighter. It moved in defined currents rather than broad blankets. It traced valleys and slopes with quiet precision, touching one area before drifting to another. Scale shifted again, from the river winding through pale reflection to the arc of a reed bending in breeze to the sensation of air passing freely. Within the cave, the inward light remained contained. Light did not surge outward. It did not break concealment. Yet its stillness felt different, less compressed, more open. The space around it held balance without tension, as though the inward gathering had reached completion. The sun goddess remained present within containment, not emerging, not withdrawing further. Poised, above ground, the world sensed this poise as readiness rather than promise. Light did not declare itself. It blended. It integrated. It became part of the atmosphere rather than an external force. The long night had not ended, but its weight had shifted. Evening still arrived with depth. Darkness still settled across valleys. Lanterns were still lit at dusk. Yet night no longer felt enclosing. It felt generous. Day, when it unfolded, carried faint warmth again. Not enough to heat, enough to remember. People noticed this memory in their bodies. Muscles warmed slightly more during movement. Skin responded to air with less resistance. The body adjusted its posture unconsciously, standing a little straighter, moving with marginally greater ease. Sleep remained deep. but waking felt more complete. Thoughts assembled smoothly. The transition from rest to movement carried less friction. Animals responded similarly. Deer lifted their heads more frequently during day. Birds tested longer flights between perches. Insects shifted their patterns subtly, redistributing activity across clear intervals. The forest reorganized gently. Paths grew more distinct. Clearings held shape longer before dissolving into shadow. Sound traveled farther in the morning, softened sooner at dusk. The world regained nuance. Scale narrowed once more. From the sky layered with thinning cloud to the valley emerging at dawn, to the quiet assurance of waking. Time felt less suspended. It did not rush forward. It curved. The day regained a beginning, middle, and end, not marked by brilliance, but by texture. Morning felt different from afternoon. Afternoon leaned gently toward evening. Night still arrived without force, but it now felt like rest rather than enclosure. Within the cave, the inward light held steady. The cavern walls remained unchanged. Stone absorbed stillness without strain, but the stillness itself felt resolved, as though concealment had served its purpose. Above ground, the world did not celebrate. It did not announce return. It simply continued, now carrying light as atmosphere rather than source. Lanterns burned, rivers flowed, forests breathed. Light moved quietly among them, not as command, not as spectacle, but as presence that did not need to be named. And in that quiet presence, the world leaned forward slightly, not in anticipation, but in acceptance of what had always been possible. Warmth did not return as sensation alone. It returned as movement. It traveled slowly through the world, not rushing to reclaim what had been withheld, but finding its way back into air, into surfaces, into the quiet spaces between things. The sky did not brighten decisively. Clouds still lingered. The land remained softened, yet the air itself began to carry something new, not heat, ease. Morning no longer felt hesitant. It unfolded with a steadiness that suggested confidence rather than force. The air lifted gently from the ground, releasing moisture without hurry. Valleys emerged without effort, their shapes clear enough to be known, gentle enough to remain calm. Across the hills, the land responded. Stone surfaces held faint warmth earlier in the day, not enough to warm skin quickly, but enough to register as difference. Touch no longer met resistance, it met neutrality. Walking felt lighter. Steps pressed less deeply into earth. The ground responded with subtle firmness, supporting movement without absorbing too much of it. Scales shifted, from the sky layered with pale cloud to the surface of stone warming faintly to the sensation of weight easing in a step. Within forests, warmth traveled invisibly. It threaded itself through trunks and branches, awakening stored memory within bark. Leaves responded subtly, lifting slightly toward the air rather than resting entirely still. Moisture evaporated more evenly now. Dew did not cling as long. Mist still rose, but it thinned more readily, dissolving into air that welcomed it rather than holding it close. The forest felt more open, not brighter, breathable. Birdsong reflected this change. Calls arrived with longer arcs, traveling farther before settling. The air carried sound without distortion, allowing it to move cleanly through space. Birds did not sing louder. They sang with assurance. Their notes rested comfortably in the air, neither absorbed nor amplified excessively. Within villages, warmth revealed itself through habit. Doors were left open slightly longer in the morning. Windows remained unshuttered. People lingered outside without noticing why. Lanterns were extinguished earlier at dawn, not because darkness had vanished, but because the air itself defined space more clearly. Shadows still existed, but they did not press inward. Homes adjusted. Walls released stored warmth earlier in the day, sharing it with interior air. Rooms felt less enclosed, their boundaries less pronounced. Fires were still lit, but embers burned differently. They glowed steadily without needing attention, their warmth dispersing gently into rooms that no longer depended on them fully. Hands lingered less near flame. The body sensed balance. Within the shrine, warmth became visible through texture. Stone steps no longer held chill through mid-morning, would regain subtle variation in tone where light brushed it through thinning cloud. The courtyard felt less dense. When caretakers moved across it, their footsteps echoed less. Sound returned sooner, lighter, as though the air itself had loosened. A bell rang once in late morning. Its tone traveled cleanly, touching nearby trees and returning without delay. The sound did not linger heavily. It resolved. Beyond the village, rivers carried warmth upward. Their surfaces reflected layered sky with clear gradation. Beneath, water temperature stabilized near the surface. Fish moved upward more confidently, lingering longer before descending again. The current remained steady, but it felt less weighty. Standing near the river brought quiet clarity. The sound of flow remained constant, but it felt lighter, less enveloping. Mist still rose, but it did not obscure as fully. It thinned quickly, leaving behind freshness rather than dampness. Reeds along the banks responded smoothly. They bent and returned with less delay, responding to wine that carried more definition. Their movement traced arcs, but felt intentional rather than softened. Wind itself carried warmth now, not heat. Motion. It moved through valleys with purpose, brushing specific slopes and fields before drifting onward. It no longer spread evenly in blankets. It traveled in paths. Scale shifted again. From the river winding beneath layered sky to the reed bending in breeze to the sensation of air moving freely across skin. Within the cave, the inward light remained contained. Light did not rush outward. It did not break through stone, yet its presence felt integrated rather than isolated. The cavern walls no longer held stillness tightly. They allowed it to exist without pressure. The sun goddess remained poised within concealment. Not hidden, not revealed, balanced. Above ground, warmth continued its quiet return. It settled into air rather than surfaces. The sky remained muted, but the atmosphere felt lighter. Breathing felt easier. Movement felt less deliberate. The body responded without conscious thought. Muscles warmed more quickly during work. Joints moved with greater ease. Fatigue lifted sooner after rest. Sleep remained deep, but waking carried clarity. Thoughts aligned smoothly. Attention moved outward without effort. Animals mirrored this change. Deer traveled longer distances during day. Birds flew between perches with confidence. Insects redistributed activity across clearer intervals. The forest regained subtle layering. Clearings held shape longer. Paths re-emerged beneath growth. Sound traveled farther during day and softened gently toward evening. Evening arrived with familiarity. Darkness still settled across valleys, but it no longer felt enclosing. Lanterns were lit at dusk, but their glow felt companionable rather than necessary. Night had regained its place. It no longer dominated. It rested. Scale narrowed. From the sky easing toward evening to the warmth settling in a resting body to the steady rhythm of breath. Time regained flow. Days felt distinct again, each carrying its own weight without competition. Morning held promise without urgency. Afternoon carried steadiness. Evening invited rest. The long night had loosened its grip. Not because it was forced away, because warmth had found its way back into air. Within the cave, the inward light held steady. No tremor passed through stone, no crack formed, but the containment felt complete, as though concealment had fulfilled its purpose. Above ground, the world did not mark this as return. There was no threshold crossed, no boundary declared, only a gradual easing into balance. Lanterns burned, rivers flowed, forests breathed. Warmth moved quietly among them, not as command, not as spectacle, but as something that belonged, and in that belonging, the world leaned forward slightly. not to greet the light, but to live alongside it once more. The sky did not change its color, it changed its depth. For a long while, cloud had layered itself across the heavens like gauze, diffusing everything beneath it into softness. Now, without dispersing completely, those layers loosened. Space appeared between them, not empty, not bright, but open. The opening made no sound. There was no wind to announce it, no shift sharp enough to be felt immediately. It revealed itself slowly, through absence of resistance rather than presence of force. Morning arrived with ease. The air no longer held itself tightly against the land. It lifted naturally, allowing space to exist between earth and sky. Breath moved freely, no longer meeting density, no longer pressing outward. Across the valleys distance returned, not dramatically, not expansively, simply enough to be perceived. Hills stood apart again, their forms no longer merging into one another. The land regained dimension, subtle and steady, as though it had remembered how to stretch. Scale shifted, from the sky easing open above the valley to the separation between two distant ridges to the sensation of breath moving without effort. Clouds drifted apart without hurry. They did not retreat. They rearranged themselves, allowing pale light to pass through wider passages. The light did not strike the land directly. It filtered, resting rather than touching. The effect was not brightness. It was clarity. Fields responded first. Their colors deepened slightly, not vivid, not radiant but present. Greens carried variation. Browns held warmth without darkness. The ground felt less compacted beneath foot, responding with gentle firmness. Walking felt natural. Steps aligned with rhythm rather than caution. The body no longer measured its movement against density. Within forests, this opening revealed layers long held together. Tree trunks stood apart more distinctly, branches separated visually, no longer blending into mass. Leaves caught faint gradations, reflecting subtle difference rather than uniform shade. Light threaded itself through the canopy, not in beams, in suggestion. Birdsong followed. Calls traveled farther, clearer. They did not echo heavily. They arrived, settled, and resolved. The forest accepted sound without holding it too long. Movement felt unforced. Animals stepped into clearings with confidence. Paths reopened beneath growth. The forest did not hurry to reclaim space. It allowed passage. Scale narrowed. From the canopy opening to pale sky to the texture of bark revealed to the quiet steadiness of a heartbeat. Within villages, the opening expressed itself through rhythm. Morning began earlier without prompting. Doors opened naturally. People stepped outside and paused not to observe, but to exist within the air. Lanterns were no longer needed after dawn. They were extinguished gently, without thought. Shadows still existed, but they no longer defined space. Homes felt balanced. Walls held warmth without enclosure. Light moved through windows with clarity, not intensity. Rooms felt complete without adjustment. Fires were lit as before, but their presence felt supplementary rather than central. The body no longer leaned toward them for equilibrium. Hands moved freely. Work resumed without deliberation. Tasks flowed. Movements found their pace without resistance. Within the shrine, the opening was felt as alignment. Stone steps revealed full texture beneath softened light. Wood held subtle gradations where cloud-filtered light brushed it. The courtyard felt spacious, neither enclosed nor exposed. The bells rang once in mid-morning. The tone carried cleanly, touching distant trees before returning gently. The sound did not linger. It resolved. No one paused to mark it. Beyond villages, rivers reflected the open sky. Their surfaces held layered light pale above, deeper below. The current moved steadily, no longer pressing sound outward heavily. Standing near the river felt grounding rather than enveloping. Mist still rose, but it did not cling. It lifted and thinned quickly, dissolving into air that carried it away without struggle. The scent of water and earth lingered briefly, then passed. Reeds along the bank stood with renewed flexibility. They'd bent in breeze that carried direction rather than weight. Their movement traced clean arcs, returning without delay. Wind traveled with purpose. It followed valleys, brushed slopes, then moved on. It did not blanket the land. It passed through it. Scale shifted again. From the river reflecting open sky to the reed moving in directed wind to the sensation of air passing freely across skin. Within the cave, the inward light remained. Light did not surge outward. It did not fracture stone. Yet the space around it felt complete, as though containment had reached its natural conclusion. Stillness no longer compressed. It rested openly. The sun goddess remained within balance. Not hidden, not revealed, present, above ground. The world sensed this presence as coherence. Light did not arrive as an object. It existed as atmosphere. The long period of concealment had not weakened the world. It had taught it how to receive without grasping, how to rest without stagnating. Now, as the sky opened, the world did not reach upward. It remained where it was, ready. Day and night held their distinction clearly now. Morning carried clarity. Afternoon carried steadiness. Evening invited rest without enclosure. Night arrived gently, not as shelter, but as pause. Lanterns were lit at dusk, but they no longer defined space. They accompanied it. Sleep remained deep, but dreams thinned slightly, releasing the mind sooner. Waking felt smooth, complete. Animals followed this balance naturally. Birds flew longer arcs. Deer ranged farther. Insects adjusted their cycles to clearer intervals. The forest held its layers without merging them. Paths remained visible. Clearings held shape. Sun traveled appropriately for each hour. Time resumed its curve. Not hurried, not suspended. Flowing. Scale narrowed once more. From the sky opened without sound to the valley resting beneath it to the quiet confidence of breath. The sky did not declare return. It simply opened enough. Brightness did not arrive. Light existed. Within the cave, the inward radiance remained poised. No step was taken outward. No announcement made. Because the world was already prepared. And as the sky continued to open, quietly and without insistence, the land beneath it stood balanced, no longer enduring, no longer waiting, simply present. Light did not return to reclaim anything. It resumed its place. There was no moment that could be pointed to and named as the beginning. No boundary crossed, no threshold declared. The sky did not clear fully, nor did brilliance pour down upon the land. Instead, light settled into the world as if it had always belonged there, waiting patiently for the right conditions to be received. Morning unfolded with assurance. The air held warmth now not as heat, but as ease. Breath moved freely, unencumbered by density or restraint. The space between earth and sky felt balanced, neither pressing downward nor pulling upward. Across the valleys, the land rested into clarity. Hills stood distinctly apart, their forms complete without sharpness. Fields carried color with quiet confidence. The earth no longer absorbed weight heavily. It supported movement naturally. Walking felt effortless. Steps followed rhythm rather than caution. The body no longer measured each motion against the atmosphere. Balance had returned, not imposed, but shared. Scales shifted. From the sky holding light gently to the valley resting beneath it to the sensation of standing without resistance. Clouds remained, but they no longer dominated. They moved across the sky with purpose, allowing light to pass through broad openings. The light did not strike. It spread, filling space evenly without glare. Shadows still existed. They defined form without enclosing it. They moved smoothly as the day progressed, marking time gently rather than dividing it. Within forests, the return was felt as coherence. Branches separated cleanly against the sky. Leaves reflected subtle variation, no longer muted, no longer shining. Light threaded itself through the canopy evenly, illuminating depth without fragmenting it. Birdsong flowed naturally. Calls arrived at appropriate times, carrying clarity without urgency. The forest accepted sound and released it cleanly. Movement felt aligned. Animals traveled with confidence, paths reopening fully beneath growth. Clearings held shape. The forest no longer pressed inward. Scale narrowed. From the forest opening to balanced sky to the texture of bark warmed by air to the steady pulse within the chest. Within villages, light resumed its role without ceremony. Homes no longer needed to compensate for absence. Walls held warmth comfortably. Windows allowed air and light to move through freely. Lanterns were lit at dusk, not from necessity, but from habit. Their glow accompanied evening rather than defining it. They marked transition gently, their presence familiar rather than essential. Fires were tended lightly. They provided comfort without anchoring the body. The air itself carried enough warmth to sustain balance. People moved with ease. Work resumed its natural pace. Rest arrived without heaviness. The rhythm of the day felt complete again. Within the shrine, the return felt like alignment restored. Stone steps warmed gradually beneath daylight. Wooden beams revealed full texture, grain visible in quiet clarity. The courtyard felt open, held by sky rather than enclosed by shadow. The bells rang once at midday. Their tone traveled cleanly, touching distant edges of the grounds before returning softly. The sound did not linger excessively. It resolved. No pause followed. Life continued. Beyond the village, rivers reflected the balanced sky. Their surfaces carried light without distortion. The current moved steadily, no longer absorbing sound heavily, no longer scattering it. Standing near the river felt refreshing. The sound of water flowed with clarity, neither enveloping nor distant. Mist rose briefly and dissolved quickly, leaving air fresh rather than damp. Reeds along the banks responded with fluid movement. They bent in wind that carried warmth and direction, returning smoothly without delay. Their motion traced gentle arcs that resolved naturally. Wind moved freely now. It traveled across land without resistance, brushing slopes and fields before continuing onward. It did not linger. It passed. Scale shifted again. From the river reflecting balanced light to the reed moving in open air to the sensation of warmth against skin. Within the cave, the inward light remained. Light did not surge outward. It did not fracture stone. Yet something essential had completed itself. The space no longer felt like containment. It felt like origin. The sun goddess remained present, not emerging, not retreating, but existing in harmony with a world that had learned to live without demand. Above ground, the world felt whole, not because light had returned fully, but because balance had been restored. Day and night resumed their roles without competition. Morning carried clarity. Afternoon held steadiness. Evening invited rest. Night arrived as pause, not enclosure. Sleep remained deep. Dreams softened, releasing the mind gently before waking. Rest felt complete rather than prolonged. Animals followed this rhythm effortlessly. Birds flew with confidence. Deer ranged across familiar paths. Insects settled into clear cycles. The forest held its structure. Paths remained visible. Clearings stayed open. Growth continued without crowding. Time flowed, not rushed, not suspended. Moving forward with quiet assurance. Scale narrowed once more. From the sky settled into balance to the valley resting beneath it to the calm certainty of breath. The world did not celebrate. It did not mark the moment, because there was no moment to mark. Light had not returned to conquer darkness. It had resumed its place among things that already knew how to exist. Lanterns burned at night. Rivers flowed by day. Forests breathed between them. And within all of it, warmth moved freely, no longer remembered, no longer awaited, simply present. The sky continued to open and close as it always had. Clouds drifted. Light passed. Shadow followed. Nothing demanded attention. Nothing resisted rest. The story did not end with brightness. It ended with balance, and as the day softened toward evening once more, the world settled into itself complete, unhurried, and whole. And so the world continues, not forward in haste, not backward in longing, but onward in balance. The sky carries its layers gently now. Clouds drift without urgency. Light moves through them as it chooses, sometimes present, sometimes softened, never demanding attention. Across the valleys, the land rests into its rhythm. Hills hold their distance. Rivers follow their courses without resistance. Forests breathe between movement and stillness, remembering both equally. Lanterns are lit as evening arrives, not to replace the sky, but to accompany it. Their glow settles into familiar corners, warming spaces already at ease. Night comes without weight. It no longer encloses the world. It pauses it. Day, when it returns, does not announce itself. It opens quietly, touching stone, wood, and water with a presence that asks nothing. Within the earth, warmth moves freely, now shared, balanced, unguarded, not held tightly, not given away, simply present where it belongs. The long stillness has passed, not because it was broken, but because it was completed. Nothing needed to be taken back. Nothing needed to be restored. The world learned how to carry itself, how to rest with an absence, how to receive without grasping. And so light resumes its place not above all things, but among them. Breath slows, sound softens, edges blur gently. The story does not close, it settles. Like evening settling into night, like warmth settling into air, like a thought dissolving before it needs to finish. The sky remains, the land remains, balance remains, and in that balance, nothing more needs to be said. The light rests, the air stills, silence continues.